Mark, and I'm here with Bailey, and we are program managers in the identity division here at Microsoft. So we work on Active Directory, Active Directory Federation Services, and Azure Active Directory. And Bailey and I work on a team that works with customers on their deployments of Azure Active Directory, and we take the learning and feedback from those deployments and we work it back into the product to make it easier and better for everybody else. So Bailey and I actually spend most of our time, probably like 80% of our time, talking more to the IT pro side of the house. So I know this is a developer focused call. So we're going to talk about what is application consent and why you should be caring about this if you haven't started so already. Like I said, you guys are developers, so you probably have seen this if you've been spending some time in this space. But if not, we'll get a good level set for everybody, and we'll show why you really should be caring about this as there's some emerging attacks that are starting to use this. Then we're going to cover some key permissions to look for and how to investigate these consent grants you may have in your environment. And then Bailey is going to talk about some best practices everyone should be doing to protect yourself from these consent attacks. And she's also going to be doing all of the demos throughout the talk. So she definitely has the hardest job between the two of us. But okay, let's get into it here. So what is application consent? So if you've never actually heard of this, there's a good chance you have probably seen this. So if you think about it on your mobile phone, when you've added an application, and let's say the application is going to add some sort of funny filter or that kind of stuff, taking your picture, and the application needs to ask for a set of permissions to be able to do that. So it's probably going to ask for the ability to access your camera. It's probably going to ask for the ability to write to your photos so you can save that funny picture you just took, and it's probably going to ask for the ability to read the context of your phone. That way you can send that funny picture to your friends and family right from the application. The Azure AD permission and consent model works in a very, very similar way. So we're going to have some sort of application that wants to access organizational data, and this organizational data is going to be accessed through some sort of resource APIs. And what the application can do with those APIs are going to be determined based on the permissions, which can be granted through the process here called application consent, which can be done by either an administrator or an end user. And actually, Bailey will talk about that in the best practices section around what some of the configuration you can do around this. But to go down a little bit deeper here and kind of align ourselves with some of the OAuth terminology, if you haven't heard this before, that application is actually called a client, which can be a mobile web or running as some sort of service. It doesn't actually have to be like a thick client type of application. It can really be anything. And this is the thing that's going to be requesting access to the data on behalf of that user. And the thing that client is going to be trying to talk to is actually called, in the OAuth spec, is called the protected resource. So this is what's actually exposing that data or functionality to that client application. This is usually going to be a web API. In the Microsoft identity side, this is going to be the Microsoft Graph. And what the application has the ability to do is going to be determined based on that permissions it's been granted to. So you can see here as an example, ability to read a user's OneDrive files through Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph there is that protected resource. Read is the permission, and the client wants to be able to read the files. So what does it actually look like? So this picture here on the right is what the end user experience looks like. So we have a Contoso test application. It wants the ability to read the contacts, read the calendar, and be able to read the user's profile. And the end user here has the ability to accept this grant or actually deny this grant. Dean, I see you have a question about finding out consent to what has been consented to a long time ago. And if you just hang tight a little bit, we will cover exactly how you can go do that a little bit later in the talk. Okay, so what actually, from a consent terminology here, we have a few different terms we want to go over with you. So the first one is that consent prompt, which we just showed you. That's that actual dialog box. And the act of saying yes to that consent prompt is called a consent grant. Now, there's two different ways to consent. There's end user consent and there's administrative consent. Administrative consent is usually done because of one or two reasons. The first reason is when an admin consents to an application, they are consenting to it for all users in the organization. So the end users will no longer see that consent grant dialog box. So a really good scenario for this is the native mail app on iOS. So if an end user goes to connect their mail app to their Office 365 mailbox, the application is going to ask for permissions to like read mail, send mail, things like that. And the user can say yes, they can do a consent grant from that. But as an organization, we can say, we're okay with this application being used. So the admin can go in and consent to it for all users in the organization. Now, the next user that goes to use that native mail app for the first time, they will not see that consent dialog box because the admin has already consented to it. It will just work for them. So that's that first scenario. The second scenario is when an application is asking for high privilege operations. So we don't let end users consent to things like being able to read and write to everything in the directory, or maybe read and write to everyone's mailboxes, or if the application is asking for application permissions, we don't let end users consent to that because those are very, very powerful permissions. So some permissions may require an admin to get involved to determine if it's okay and their consent to it. Okay, so the thing I just thought about here is admin application permissions, and the other thing to know about here is delegated permissions. These are the two different types of permissions. And we want most of our applications, if possible here, since it's a developer calls, to use the delegated permissions, because the permissions the application has is what the user has and what the application has the ability to do. It doesn't actually give it more permissions than it already has. And this requires the user to be signed in and present to be able to make those calls. These are the types of permissions that the non-administrative users can consent to, or like I said, if it's a higher level privilege permission, the admin can consent to it. But the key thing here is that effective permissions line, which, like I said, is the intersection of what the user can do and what the application can do. So if let's say the application has the ability or asks for the ability to read all mail, and the user goes to use it, and it's the on behalf of user calls here, it's not going to let that user read mail from every single person's mailbox because that user doesn't have the ability to read everyone's mailbox. They can only use that application on their mailbox. So that's the effective permission, is what the user has and what the application has. You're not giving the application more permissions. Now, this is frequently called scopes, OAuth 2 permission grams, or app plus user permissions, depending on what type of documentation you're looking at. But the second one here is application permissions. And this is very, very powerful because these applications can run without a user being signed in or present. These always require admin consent, and whatever permissions that admin consents to, that is what that application has the ability to do. So if that application is asking for the ability to do directory read write all, which is basically like a global admin, right? Like it can do whatever it wants in the directory, and an admin consents to it, that application can do that. So these are very, very powerful permissions. We want to make sure as developers we're using delegated permissions whenever possible, but sometimes you do need to use application permissions. This requires an admin to consent to this. Now, this is sometimes also called roles, app roles, or app only permissions. So this is kind of a summary of what I just kind of talked about in the previous slides. We have our delegated permission model, which is what we want most of our developers to use. This is good for those mobile apps, the web apps, the single page apps. This requires a user can consent to this if your configuration is set up that way, or an admin can do it for all users. Most importantly, requires a user to be signed in and present, and it's accessing that data on behalf of the user. And again, that effective permission model there at the very bottom, this is a nice little graphic for this, is the combination of what the user has and what the application has. It doesn't grant the user more permissions when they're using the application. Application permissions is good for something that runs, without a user present, runs as a service. Only admins can consent to this. And whatever permissions that are consented to this application, that's exactly what that application has the ability to do. So these are very, very powerful. And with that, I think Bailey has a demo lined up for us.
Yes, I do. So let me pull this over and show you guys what this actually looks like in your environment, both from the perspective of an end user and also from the perspective of an admin. So for your end user, this is what that consent prompt looks like. And so you may have been familiar with this, as Mark was mentioning earlier, on your cell phone or something as an end user typically. But if you have never, seen this screen before, this is what it looks like inside of Azure AD. And to show you the differences between the delegated and the application permissions here, we have a delegated permission for signing in and reading the user's profile. So you know that it's a delegated permission because it mentions that the signed in user must be present, which Mark mentioned earlier denotes the difference between delegated and application permissions. Now, for delegated permissions, you as an admin can control whether end users can consent to those independently without your approval, and I'll get into that toward the end near the best practices section. But the reason why in this particular scenario for this particular tenant, the end user has to enter a justification to request that their admin approves it is because there's an application permission here. So this one right here, the create chat and channel messages with anyone's identity, any timestamp. This is something that does not require a signed in user present. So as you can see right here, it says without a signed in user. And as Mark mentioned again, with the effective permissions, because I as a user can't use anyone's identity, this would be the effective permissions overlapping would just be what I as a user am able to do. Now, on the admin side, this is what that exact same application looks like. And let me just put them side by side so you can see the two differences here. But so as an admin, this is me logged in as my admin account within the same tenant. This is for the exact same app, Woodgrove shipping info. And you can see that it looks a little bit different on this side, particularly, excuse me, I think that this was not when I PIM elevated up. Well, no worries. If the demo gods aren't playing nicely, I have some slides to just show you exactly what this looks like here. So as an admin, this is what it should look like if I was able to properly PIM elevate and it wasn't just my normal account. But so you'll see that it'll say instead permissions requested for review for your organization. So as Mark mentioned earlier, when an admin consents to an app like this, it is on behalf of the entire tenant. So as you can see right here, it mentions that no one else will be prompted to review these permissions because they will be granted for all users within your organization. So it's an important distinction to be aware of, and now you know what those both look like, and we'll dive into how you can set those up for particular apps and for particular users later in the session.
All right. Quick question here from Daniel. They asked, what constitutes a user being signed in? This means they have an active session, that they're logged in, that they have an access token, and they're using it. Okay. So what actually happens when you click accept on that consent dialog box? There's a couple of things here. So we have a little bit of work to do on the Azure AD side. This is a little more complicated than it probably should be, but there's two places where applications will live. So the first one here is the app registrations, and this is the definition of the application itself. So you can kind of think about this as it's kind of the back of the house configuration of the application. So like, is this application going to be a single tenant app or a multi-tenant app? Is this application accessible from Azure AD users, or is this going to be accessible for Azure AD users and people that have Microsoft accounts? So that's the stuff that is, your Xbox, your Outlook, Outlook.com, that kind of stuff. And for those that didn't see the announcement yesterday, we announced that you can remove your password from your Microsoft account. So you should go do that. I did that yesterday, and I think Bailey did that for hers as well. But those types of accounts. So that's going to be in the definition of an app. In enterprise apps, that is where we're going to have the service principal, and this is the representation of the application in that tenant. So when you consent to an application that's a multi-tenant app, you will see that in the enterprise app section. This is kind of the front of the house type of configuration. So this is where you'll set your conditional access policies as your IT administrators in the environment. So just to kind of hammer this home, if you have so we have this timekeeping app here, and Bailey and I work there, and we have that line of business app here. So we're going to have an app registration for the timekeeping app, and we're also going to have a service principal for that timekeeping application. Then we sell it to another company, and when they consent to it, they will have a timekeeping app in their enterprise apps, but they will not see anything in the ability in their app registrations. It's only going to be in their enterprise apps. So if you go back and look at this in your tenant today, so any of those line of business apps, you will be creating in your Azure AD tenant, you will see an app registration and a service principal in your enterprise apps. But for things like Exchange Online, you will not see anything in app registrations. That lives in the Microsoft tenant. You will only see that in the enterprise apps. And this is really, really important to understand, because service principals is the security principle. And there are many, many ways that service principals can be granted access. And we just saw two of them, right? We saw the app-only permissions as well as the delegated permission grants. But service principals can actually be assigned roles from a directory perspective as well as an Azure perspective. So just like an end user, a service principal can hold a role. A service principal can be an owner of a group, an application, and other service principals. So they have very, very powerful permissions in this regard. They can make configuration changes to an application. And these service principals can also be added to Azure Key Vault ACL. So these are very, very powerful permissions. We want to make sure that we're keeping track of our service principals, and we want to make sure we're managing these just like we would manage users. All right. Now, this is more for the IT pros in the audience, but usually at this point, there is somebody that is like Grandpa Simpson and they didn't want to go to the cloud at all. And now they realize that they have a bunch of mystery applications in their tenant and they do not know where they came from. There's a bunch of assignments to these applications because people were able to consent to it and they don't understand that. And they don't understand what permissions these applications have, what power it has in their environment, and they feel like they kind of lost control of their infrastructure and their environment. And they're not totally wrong. There's some good stuff in here that if you didn't know about this and you didn't know what to do, it can kind of feel like you've kind of lost control. But we actually have some really good guidance on how to kind of maybe regain that if you weren't paying attention to this from the beginning and things you should do from a best practice perspective. But the other thing is, this isn't like a unique cloud app specific thing. Like you could ask these same questions about your on-prem applications and people standing up applications to talk to your on-prem Active Directory and things like that. So this isn't like a cloud problem that's actually just appeared. You probably had this problem all along, but because everything is in a central place, you can actually get your arms around this pretty easily. And you really, really want to, because as we're starting to see some phishing and malware campaigns based on that, and I see the chats going pretty quickly. I'm sorry, I can't keep up. When Bailey goes to do the demos, I will come through and try to answer some of these things for everybody here. But the traditional malware campaign is we've seen it for a long time, right? Is we're trying to get a user to run some sort of attachment, some sort of macro here, and before it's like invoice attached, open it up, and then they kind of pivoted to a COVID theme thing, right? So we've seen this. So it's the same type of stuff where they want you to run an application that does the drop around the device, it goes and does the command and control, the whole 9 yards. This is not a new thing that people have been doing for some time. But the new thing here is actually people are moving to a consent-based phishing attack. And a lot of people haven't started to see this yet, as well as not really prepared for it. But here you can see a very similar type of style where we want you to see this COVID-19 bonus documentation you can open up. Or here we see that this application is called Office 365 Access. That icon looks kind of familiar, but it's a little older, but maybe that's okay. And if you look through those permissions the application is asking here, it wants to read our contacts, read our profile, read our mail. It wants to be able to read OneNote notebooks. That's kind of suspicious. It wants to be able to read and write to your mailbox settings. And the key thing here is when a user consents to this, and this is a delegated permission, so it's what the user has access to and what the application has access to, they're able to now suck all that mail out because the user can read their own mail. And the real scary part here is when we start to do configuration changes to the mailbox settings. So because a user can go add a forwarding rule to their mailbox and the user consents to this application, the application also has the ability to, it's asked for that permissions, the user has those permissions, and now the application can now add, persistence mechanisms to go ahead and add that into the mailbox. So this is a really, really scary thing if we didn't know about this. And people are starting to move from those typical malware where we're having the thing run the macro on the workstation and does the C2s channel to actually doing permissions, a delegated permissions model where there's nothing on the device from a malware perspective because it's all some sort of cloud application. So this is something we're starting to see happening to some customers. We want to make sure people are aware of this from a security perspective. Okay, so now that you understand this, what are some of those permissions we should look for? I think this is some of the stuff that Dean was asking about. So the first thing here is any permissions that have wide-ranging permissions, mail star, directory read write all, anything like that. We want to make sure we understand what the application is asking for and why it needs to be able to do those. Just because an application has these permissions does not make it malicious. It may make it overprivileged, but it doesn't mean it's bad. Okay, so as administrators and developers in the org, we want to make sure we're using least privilege wherever possible. And we want to make sure when anytime an application is looking for these types of permissions, we understand why it needs this. Maybe this is some sort of e-discovery app, right? An e-discovery app needs to be able to read a lot of data across a lot of different services. It's probably going to have a lot of permissions. That doesn't make it bad. It just means it has a lot of permissions. So we want to make sure we understand any of these broad scopes of permissions like directory read write all or anything like that. Now, the other thing to think about here are low impact permissions from an organizational perspective. So stuff like user.read, email profile, these are just kind of the basic permissions. And you need to understand what you're granting access to these applications to do. And are you okay with that as an organization? Again, this is a make it back. So just to give you an example here, these are some low permissions. We had a customer, some application wanted to be able to do some of this stuff, like basically read the gal, okay, read the gal. And the end user has the ability to do this. They consented to the application and they went on their merry way. And then several months later, their executive was browsing some site where this application gets used. And they were very, very surprised to see that their first name, last name, email, and their internal gal picture was on this website. And their first reaction was, we've been hacked. And they hadn't been hacked, right? The end users have the ability to read the gal. Like they can do that. And they granted this, the permission users, end users had the ability to consent to applications. The application asked for some low permissions. They consented to it. They went on their way and it did it. So they didn't actually get broken into or hacked or anything. They just let their end users do this. That may or may not be right for you and your organization. And this is the stuff to kind of think about and have a discussion about of what we want people. Do we want end users to consent to applications? And if so, what permissions are they okay with? And are we okay with as an organization? Now, I have some customers, the answer to this is no, nobody can consent to anything. Everything needs to be reviewed by an admin of some kind to look through the application, which is, good from a security perspective, but, they have a very long backlog and it's very, very slow to get through. Other companies I work with, their answer is let people consent. We don't want to be in the way of the business. If they want to use that boomerang app that like resends your mail back to you at like the end of the day or whatever, like let them. Like why are we going to hold up the business? Let them do this. So it really is up to you to decide as an organization if you want people to be able to consent to this application. So just my point here is just because they're low impact doesn't mean they're like, you could run into that scenario where someone consented to something and that data was accessed and you may not have wanted to. So this is something you want to think about from an administrative perspective.
All right. And since earlier I had a little snafu with my with PIM elevating up, I'm just going to fall back to the slides. So I'm sorry I didn't make the proper sacrifices to the demo gods this morning, but I'm going to keep it moving for y'all to make sure that you're still getting the content you need. So since my admin didn't consent to that application that I showed you previously, I do want to show you what this might look like in your tenant and what an over-permissioned app may look like. And so, for example, here, this is an app that is malicious because I believe Mark mentioned earlier that sometimes these will try to hide in plain sight. So as you can see, Woodgrove is the name of the fictitious tenant, fictitious company that my users work at. And this is a Woodgrove app with 3 O's in it trying to blend in, and admin must have consented this. And so I'm going to show you what that app may be able to do in your environment. And so particularly, I think that I was responding a little bit in the chat as we went about seeing which ones are application versus delegated permissions. And it's a lot easier to see within the Azure portal because it'll be clearly laid out. And you can see that this column here, if I were able to scroll up on the screenshot, it'll say granted admin consent, yes or no, and all of that. So right here, I really want to focus on user read write all because that's something that is very powerful for an application to do. And I think a lot of folks don't fully understand that it can literally do anything that falls within the scope of those permissions. So I want to pick on Lisa again, who's my user that I was showing you toward the beginning on that application consent screen. And so I'm just on her My Account page where you could see her name, her job title, email address, and all that jazz. And so for the purposes of this, I just want to show y'all in Microsoft Graph how this might work. But also toward the end, there's a sample malicious app that if you want to go scare some people with it, you're able to go play around with that. But since this is easier to showcase, I figured we would do it here. So within Graph Explorer, I'm able to go and get some information about Lisa. And so as you can see here, I have her display name, her job title, all of that stuff that was featured prominently on her My Account page. And so right here, I want to change up her display name, and I'm going to pick a very silly name for her to have, but just to demonstrate that, you could really name her whatever you want to name her. It could be, Satya Nadella, any sort of figure within your organization or public figure that the name could be changed to. So when I go through and I actually make that change, it'll showcase in Graph Explorer, but more importantly, it'll also show on her My Account page and everywhere else where that data is being used. And so this is a little bit of a silly example, but I really want to drive home what that could look like if you do have an app that is consented to. And this, of course, was a very high level permission. And Mark mentioned earlier that some of those lower level permissions could also be nefarious. And just because an app has user read write all doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It's just something that as a developer, you may want to be thinking about, do I really need that permission in order to achieve the task that this app is trying to do? And so with that, I think Mark is going to walk you through how to investigate those illicit consent grants and what they may look like.
Yeah, we had a lot of comments in the chat about how do I look for this stuff. So I think we've sufficiently scared everybody even before we got to your demo there, Bailey. So, okay, so how do I look for this stuff? There's a couple places you can look. The first place is if you just have a handful of apps in the Office 365 portal, you can look in the Security and Compliance Center audit logs. And if you see anything that says, is admin consent set to true? This means somebody with either global admin or cloud app admin or app admin has granted that access to probably a large set of data. So you want to probably start with that. But you can look at that in Office 365. The other place to see it, I saw some people mention this in the chat, is in the Azure AD portal as well. So in the actual enterprise apps section, you can look through permissions. You can also see this in your audit logs and make sure you're sending your audit logs off to some sort of SIEM of some kind. This only works if you probably have a handful of apps. For most of the customers that we work with, they have a lot of apps. So you need some sort of way to actually script this. So if you go to aka.ms/get Azure AD Permissions, we have a PowerShell script that will help enumerate all this, pull out all the stuff, and show you what applications have what permissions and who's consented to what. So that's a really nice way to start with that. And then lastly, if you're into more of the like app gallery, like MCAS, like if you're in these deeply like in the tunneling of the apps and all that kind of stuff, MCAS will also show you this. The CASB type of stuff is what I was thinking of. So MCAS will show you this. This is a different license than what you have in Azure AD, just to kind of call that out. All right. So let's take a look at what we should start doing once we get into there. So what should you start with? The first thing is you want to start with, we have a tab in this output, and Bailey will show you this here, is the high-risk apps as well as user-assigned account tab. So any application that you don't recognize, it's like not a Microsoft application with these very high permissions, you probably want to start with to make sure we understand specifically what is that application, and then if we can figure out who consented to it, because that means an admin has consented to this application, and it's very, very powerful. So we want to probably start with that, and the user assigned count all users means all users can access this because an admin consented to it. So we want to probably start with that. The second place to look for then is look at the high risk user tab and do a quick scan to see if there's anyone that has access to that sensitive info. So stuff that, if somebody called you and said, this account is compromised, and your stomach just kind of drops and you'd be like, oh no, that's bad. Like look for those people, right? So anyone that is your executives, anyone that's in finance, people that maybe have access to sensitive information, like, mergers and acquisitions and things like that. Look for those users, see what applications they've consented to or what applications they have. That's another good place to start. And then also start looking at the actual delegated permissions, looking for those read, write, all permissions. Those are ones, again, that doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means they have a lot of privilege. So we want to make sure we look at those and we understand those.
And so let me show you what that looks like in that output. So if you were to run that PowerShell script, this is what that looks like. And here's that high risk apps tab that Mark mentioned earlier. But this actual output has a lot more than that. So you're actually able to see those permissions by user. And these are, some folks at Microsoft that play around with that demo tenant of Woodgrove. We have the creator of the Woodgrove tenant who has probably the most listed here, and also those high risk users. So there I am, one of those higher risk users within that demo tenant. And so you're really able to play around with a lot of the same data that you would get via other means as well. But if you are someone who's really into pivot tables, this I've already cleaned up a little bit and made it a little bit prettier, but you're actually able to go by those specific permissions. So you could see for group read write all of the different apps that have been granted that permission. Also, you could see permissions by risk rating. So whether or not those are lower versus higher permissions and where they come from. And then also all of the raw data is here as well. If you would like to display this or visualize it better for the purposes of being in your organization. Also, since this is all on GitHub and this is a developer audience, if you guys would like to make some changes to that script, or if there are some things that you would like to see improved, by all means, we would love for it to be collaborative and to improve what we have going here.
All right. You've taken a look at this and you're looking through applications. What else should you look for here? So as Bailey called out here, apps trying to blend in. So she had that app that had too many O's in it, things misspelled. This is the typical types of spam type of stuff that's trying to masquerade. So apps trying to blend in, things where things are suspicious, such as they're consenting to applications in weird hours. People are consenting to stuff they shouldn't normally consent to. This is just the typical spam type of stuff. So these are some of those indicators of compromise to look for, looking away from their daily activities. This is just kind of like the traditional blue team type of like, what should you look for from like an attack perspective. Now, a really interesting thing here is the date and time. So we talk about this as sustained persistence. So let's say an attacker compromises a user account. They get their password, they didn't have MFA on, they log in as that user, and they go in then and start consenting to applications. And then that user changes their password, you guys do IR, that's good. Those applications are still there and they still have access. So this is a good thing to add if you know an account has been compromised. Look right around that date and time to see if they've consented to other applications around that time. So that's kind of a good IOC to look for. But okay, how should you investigate this? So this is a tip from our DART team. Our DART team, if you've never heard of our DART team, you're in good company. That's good. Our DART team is the folks at Microsoft that come do incident response in some really gnarly situations. So one of the things they've suggested here is when you're trying to determine the scope of an attack, if you're able to scope it down to the specific application that the application was consented to. So if you know it's just Exchange or just OneDrive, scope that down. That actually makes the search run much, much faster. Okay, so an attack is confirmed. You want to start your incident response process. So the first question everyone here should be asking is, does our incident response process cover this scenario? And for a lot of customers, the answer is no. We didn't even know this was a thing. We don't even know what to do about this. And that's actually okay. But if you want to go to aka.ms/IR playbooks, we have some incident response playbooks for this exact scenario, as well as some other stuff around password spray and things like that. Take a look at that and start pulling these in and start thinking about this, what you want to do about this scenario, and start working it into your stuff. So you don't reinvent the wheel, use what we've already given you. Then to stop and remediate, disable the service principal, you can revoke the consent grant, revoke any roles, and disable sign-in for that account. But the good thing here at the very end I want to call out is look for those persistence mechanisms. That example I showed you where the application had the ability to make mailbox changes. The user has the ability and the app has the ability, it can do that. So we've seen that where an application creates those mail forwarding rules. And then, if you reset the account like I talked about, but you didn't clean up this application, it can go in there and keep updating those mail forwarding rules. So you want to look for those persistent mechanisms. We call this out in that IR playbook there, but take a look at that.
All right. And so now I know that we've had a lot of questions in the chat about some best practices and some things that y'all could be doing. So I think that this is probably going to be the most pertinent section for some of those. And then I've tried to answer some of the questions as we've gone, but we can also—
I'll take a look too and try to answer while you're going.
Yeah. Or thank you, Mark. And so first, to get into some steps that you can do to protect your organization. So usually this is for, more of that IT pro side, but as a developer, it's important to know that this exists as well. And so what we typically recommend folks do is that there are 3 different options for user consent. So I saw some questions in the chat about, why can a user consent to certain things, or how can I, restrict that? And so there are 3 different options that we allow within the portal. So one, where you cannot allow users to consent, which Mark mentioned that there's a customer that just has it where, nope, lock it down, that's the way we want it. Or you can have it where users can consent to any app that has those delegated permissions. So if you also are in an organization where anything that obstructs business, is bad, so we just want for everyone to be able to do their jobs, that's an option that's available as well. Or we typically recommend the Goldilocks option in the middle, so allowing users to consent to apps from verified publishers. And when I say verified publisher, those are apps that are verified through our Microsoft Partner Network. And so we know that those apps are coming from the creators that they say they are coming from. Something else that you can do for this is to use MCAS. So within MCAS, you can automatically revoke an app or a specific user from an app when that risk is detected there, if that's available to you within your organization. Another step that you could do, and so for the IT pros that you work with, this is enabled by default, but just because it's enabled by default doesn't mean that somebody may have turned it off within your environment, but it's called risk-based step-up consent. And essentially what it is that when a risky consent request is detected, it'll be stepped up. So it'll require that admin approval instead of just allowing that user to approve, even if on the previous slide where I showed you, they are allowed to do so. So the warning will be showed to users and admins, but again, only that admin can actually grant it. And then audit events are going to be logged. So I believe somebody in the chat also asked about, hey, is this able to be viewed? Who consented to what at what time? And yes, that is available. So you can go back and look at all of that information if something were to happen. Something else you can do is detect those risky OAuth apps. So earlier I showed what that script looks like when you run it, but here again is the aka.ms link for that, where you can audit those apps and view those consented permissions. So if some of these options below, like Azure Monitor and MCAS, are not available to you, I do know of some customers who set up like a recurring calendar event so that they go on ahead and run this script regularly. So if that's something that would pertain to your organization, that's a good option as well. But something even better is to use Azure Monitor. So with Azure Monitor, you can set alerts to automatically notify you whenever an app meets those certain criteria. So for example, if an app has those very high permissions, or if an app was authorized by over 50 users, something to stay on your radar and to be in the know about. Something else is to use a hunting solution like MCAS. And so with this, you'll be able to see permissions, higher level permissions, be able to see if apps are also authorized by those external users. And it just gives you some additional functionality there. Now, this is probably the most relevant slide to all of you, since this is a developer focused call. So I want to spend a little bit more time on this one. And so you're probably, or to back up a little bit, we've all been there where we're trying to get something to run and we just use the highest level permission possible because we just want it to work. And so we've been trying to make it easier for folks to determine whether apps are over permissioned or if there is a lower level permission you could be using. And so since build 2019, we've actually increased the number of permissions that we have by over 60%. And with that, we have over 20 new identity and access permissions. And I believe Dee in the chat was the one asking about Teams permissions. And so with that, we have over 25 new Teams permissions available. And specifically, if you are looking to do some work with enabling apps to access only the teams that they need, we have an aka.ms link for you there as well at rsc-teams, which will go into some more detail about that. And so also it's important to know that, I'm sure that all of you as developers know this already, but just to really drive it home, to only ask for what is absolutely necessary. And those directory.star permissions are going to be virtually never least privileged in any use case. But to make it a little bit easier on y'all, we do have two really great resources here. One is our graph best practices. If you go to that aka.ms link, we have some great information for you there on best practices. And then we also have our identity platform checklist as well. But I think the coolest thing for y'all that I really want to draw your attention to are our free workshops, both for IT pros and developers. And so Kyle Marsh on our team is absolutely incredible, and he hosts these free workshops, I believe once a month, but that link, the upcoming LOB IT Pro, a little bit of a word salad there, but he regularly updates, I believe, monthly with different workshops that you can attend completely for free. And so you could just register for it and encourage other folks within your organization to register for it. There's one that's targeted more at developers where he actually ties in and goes through the code. Then there's one also more so for IT pros. So if you have some IT pros that you work with or that you know of who may be interested as well, please share this with them. And if for whatever reason the time zones or the dates that Kyle is hosting these don't line up for you, we also have a lot of that guidance captured in our YouTube series at aka.ms/identity developer series, where you'll be able to watch and recap some of those clips on your own time. So I think that for this audience, this is probably, one of the most key slides that I can share with you with all of these resources here. But whether you're on the IT pro side or developer side, or just as an end user, something important to note is that if you see something, say something. So if an app looks suspicious, and if you're either the end user consenting to it or the admin seeing it, you report it to Microsoft so that we can do something about it, because this will be sent on to some teams internally, and we can make some changes so that hopefully other folks don't see the same app in the future. Now to sum everything up with some go-dos, because I know that we've covered a lot today. So first off, something that you can take home with you is that you can inventory those applications and their permissions, either using the portal or some of the tools we mentioned earlier, or that PowerShell script if you're looking for a cheaper option there as well. If it's available to you, automating the threat response by implementing risk-based step-up consent, which should be enabled by default, but if it has been flipped off, you talk to your admins about getting it flipped on, and creating some MCAS policies if that is something, within your licensing structure. Something else that you could do is to educate your organization on consent tactics. And so I know that I showed you a very cheap version of how you can use an overpermissioned app to do some nefarious things. But Mark actually has a really great example on his GitHub, a great sample app that you can use to scare some people, really drive this point home as well. Something else you could do is that typically we're talking to an IT pro crowd where we would say educate your developers, but since this is a crowd of developers, I would really encourage you to check out these 3 links, especially the one at the bottom, the upcoming ID LOB IT Pro link for those free workshops. They're a fantastic resource and I highly recommend you check them out. And something else that we have on the SecOps side is that we recently published a security and operations guide that doesn't just cover application consent, but it covers many other things within Azure AD, from privileged identity management to governance and so much more. Mark and I did write the application management section of it. So it covers a lot of the things that we've shown you today, but it also has so much more. So if you're interested in checking that out, we recommend that you follow that link and also share it with other folks in your organization. And before we wrap up, I do want to leave you with some other resources that didn't necessarily get worked into the deck today, but we have some steps for securing your identity infrastructure, also some more information about that Azure AD consent framework, some more information about detecting and remediating illicit consent grants, and then finally some information on managing consent to application and evaluating those consent requests. And so with that, we'd like to thank you for your time and turn it back over to Stephen in case he has anything to close it out with, but we will be answering some questions as well if you have them.
Yeah, go ahead and ask your questions if you like. I just posted on the chat window a place where you'll be able to find the recording. We're also going to post a link to a copy of the PowerPoint from today's call.
And I'm catching up on the chat, but does anybody have a question and would like to come off mute to ask it?
I have a quick question.
What's up?
Yeah, so I have WSAFE service that was a basic authentication, but the thing is we have to authenticate that WSAFE service with Azure AD. So how can we do that?
Maybe I actually don't know because we're not on the developer team. So I think that's a good question to maybe. So a couple slides back, we talked about the developer training stuff. I would say attend that and maybe ask that question there. I actually don't know. I mean, I'm guessing it's going to be based on whatever OAuth flow and library you're going to use, but I don't think Bailey and I are the right people to answer that your question on that.
Because I looked into like .NET Core base and then ASP.NET base, like those are .NET framework base. We can actually authenticate with Azure AD with MSL library, but with WCF service, we are not finding any luck actually doing that. So that's why I'm really looking for it.
Okay, this is not. Bailey and I are not the right people to help you with that.
Okay.
So I have not a question, but more a comment with all this, and I put something into chat regarding this. It was a picture of a workflow that we developed for this that may be useful for others here with Graph. You can actually pull all your Azure applications over Graph, and we take like snapshots of those from day to day, and we monitor for changes, right? So we'll, it's actually more frequent than day to day. It's like every half hour. We'll look at all the Azure applications and then we compare them to everything we've seen before. And when we detect a new application, we extract all of the users that are assigned to it and all the permissions that it requested. We take the app URL out, which is, and obviously the name. And we send that to all the Office 365 admins for review, right? So like we let the users have the rights, but we don't have anything configured right now to not allow them to approve an app. But the only reason we have that wide open right now is because we have that automation in place. And I think that for some organizations, like doing that over Graph is out of reach. And I think that this has been a critical thing for a while. Like you said, that we had a Russian mail app. That's where this maybe a couple years ago, and that's kind of where this all started for us, where we realized that this was a problem pretty early on. But I think that now that this is becoming a more commonplace thing, and there's other token related attacks that are going on and things like that, like I think that outside of Azure Monitor, like there should be some type of base reporting, like the other security alerts that Microsoft sends to admins. I think that when a new app is added to a tenant, even if it's a first party app, like I think that those notifications should really be sent to everybody, sent to the Office 365 admin, so that everyone's aware, and not be tied to like E5 subscriptions or other products, if that makes sense.
So you want more alerting for app consent permissions?
Yeah, I just don't think it's realistic. Like the PowerShell script's great, and especially for organizations that don't have developers or engineers, right? It's great. But how do you, for some organizations who are just, have basic administrators that don't really do, how do they take that? And because it's still very manual, we're taking something that's very critical for organization security at that point and making it a very manual thing that those people are going to have to remember to run. And like, to really be aggressive, which you kind of need to be, you'd want to run that, multiple times a day. And it's just like a lot of overhead. I feel like that for something so critical that really should be kind of automated.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, I think that if you use something like Azure Monitor, or MCAS, then you would have that functionality. But if you're, not able to use those, then that script would be another more budget-friendly option. Mark, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, so the MCAS is kind of that, to kind of help with some of that. I just also pasted in a chat some of the app governance stuff around that. I think is kind of where you're getting at some of this, but it is part of MCAS today.
Cool. And the only other comment I'll say really quick is you talked about first-party applications.
Yep.
One of the ways that we deal with these third-party applications is we do one of two things. We either completely disable sign-in to them, and sometimes we completely delete them, but more often than not, we actually keep them, and we just disable sign-in to them, because if you delete it, another user can come along and just add it right back, right? Yep. So you don't necessarily want to remove it. You want to kind of keep it in your tenant, but disable sign-in against it. And sometimes, if it's an app that only a certain set of users are going to use, then we leave it enabled, obviously, but there's a user assignment required toggle, right? So you'll only allow certain users to actually authenticate with that application. But what I've noticed is that user assignment required, the Microsoft first-party applications don't include that as a toggle. So like something like the Azure portal, and I'll just put like a quick note into chat, a quick picture into chat. The Azure portal itself doesn't actually have that option, and none of the Microsoft first-party ones do. And I know that there's other options where you can turn off access to. This is just an example with Azure portal. Like you can turn off access to Azure portal in your Azure tenant settings, but you can't do it in a very granular way like you can with third-party apps, and only allow certain people to access the Microsoft first-party apps. And that's another oversight I feel that would be nice to have changed at some point. Does that make sense? Say?
Yeah.
Couldn't you use conditional access for that?
Well, in our kind of, but in our scenario, we have. So the way that I don't want to derail this and stop other people from asking questions. So I will probably not dive into that. But it would just be nice to be able to do it at the app level in a simple way, like you can for third party, because if you have an Azure role on your account, that tenant setting still allows you access to the Azure portal. When there are people that have Azure roles that we don't want having access to the Azure portal. So anyway, that's where that's coming from. So.
All right.
Will there be more resource-based consent other than Teams and SharePoint in the future?
I think they're working on stuff around SharePoint and OneDrive, but I'm not sure. Again, really probably not the right people to ask that, but we could take that back to some people.
If there are no other questions or feedback, I just want to thank everyone for joining today's call. I hope it was really informative, and I want to thank Mark and Bailey for participating today. And thank you all for being so engaged. Looking forward to seeing you in the next call next month, October 21st. Bye, everyone.